The first big horror film of 2025 is yet another remake of a well-known and well-worn IP. But is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, especially because this iteration is much more than a rehash of popular werewolf tropes. Leigh Whannell directs this modern retelling of Universal's Wolfman, which transports the viewer to current-day rural Oregon. And as in the original, it all kicks off with a death, with Girls actor Christopher Abbott returning to his childhood farm after receiving word that his father, who went missing some time ago, has finally been declared deceased. Abbott plays Blake Lovell, a stay-at-home dad just trying to keep his daughter, Ginger, safe, while his estranged wife, Ginger's mom, Charlotte, works as a successful yet distant journalist. Blake decides to take the family back to his old stomping grounds to settle his father's affairs, but their trip is cut short when the moving truck they're driving is attacked by something in the woods. Blake is wounded in the process, an event that sets into motion a slow and excruciating transformation that places the people he loves most in great danger. Most werewolf films are, at their heart, about two things: bodily changes, such as puberty, and giving in to one's baser instincts. The 2010 remake, starring Benicio del Toro, for example, portrays his character as a 19th century man of means who indulges in his id after being bitten. And there's some of that here too. Blake is a house husband tasked with cooking all the meals, running all the errands, and doing all the chores. His young daughter, Ginger, played deftly by 10-year-old Matilda Firth, is growing up right before his eyes. She's testing boundaries and expressing herself in ways that worry him, probably because he was the same way as a child. The film opens with a flashback to when Blake was a boy, raised by his overbearing and aggressive survivalist father, Grady. Grady would take Blake hunting in the woods, seemingly for deer. They spot one and Grady takes a shot and misses, scaring it away. When Blake sneaks off for a better view of the doe, his father rips into him for running off. It's not safe for a child out here. He's not ready to go off on his own just yet because Grady knows what's really living among the trees. It's the thing he was actually hunting, stories of which have been passed down for generations. It's hard for a modern horror film to make ancient legends seem scary. We have high-definition cameras and years of communal knowledge in our pockets at all times. We don't have to rely on old leather tomes or octogenarian locals to fill us in on the lore. And yet Wolfman finds a way to make us believe that such stories might have an air of truth to them within this world. And much of that has to do with choosing to set the film on an isolated farm in the middle of the Oregon forest. And that isolation extends further across generations. Grady has withdrawn himself from society. His only connection to the outside world is a CB radio and an old computer, which he uses to contact others nearby and collect sightings of the wolf creature. He is obsessed with protecting his family and seeking validation for a wild conspiracy theory he has spent much of his life obsessing over. Years later, Blake has fallen into a different form of isolation. He's far more progressive than his father ever was, allowing Ginger to put makeup on him as he cooks dinner and tends to the home. The two of them share a close bond, while Charlotte feels distanced from both her husband and her daughter due to her workaholic nature. And yet Blake cannot shake his father's influence. He's unsatisfied by his lot in life. He occupies a traditionally feminine role in the household while his wife earns a living. Blake feels his job as a father is to protect his daughter, the way a father should. We see this in an early scene where he yells at her after she almost barrels into someone on the street because she's not paying attention or listening to his directions. He lashes out in these small moments, and we see traces of the scars Grady had left behind. Blake feels forgotten and unseen, while Charlotte has a whole life outside of their apartment. And his decision to take her and Ginger to his childhood home in order to save their crumbling family only winds up isolating him even more, because not 5 minutes into arriving at the farm, Blake is attacked and wounded by the thing in the woods. His transformation is a slow one. It doesn't happen in seconds, as with the Lon Chaney Jr. version, nor is it as shocking as in 1981's An American Werewolf in London. It's a slowly boiling kettle, similar to Cronenberg's The Fly. Blake's changes are subtle at first, and even he doesn't notice them, but his family does. Blake's turn into the creature is painful and affects everyone in the house. He thinks the threat is out there, on the other side of the door, when in reality, his actions have turned him into the very thing he'd been trying to protect them from all along. Now, if you're expecting Abbott to be covered in dark hair with an elongated snout, don't get your hopes up. His final form is less of a full-blown body transformation and more of a gradual mutation. But Wolfman's focus isn't on its creature design. It's a story about generational trauma, a point that might as well be illuminated on a Times Square billboard in the film's third act. It reinforces the fact that we bear the wounds of our parents' failings, some of which may heal over time, but most simply harden over, leaving rough, unsightly scars behind. Wolfman is also about men struggling with change and toxic masculinity. Left to their own devices, devoid of community or support, it's easy for them to fall prey to ideologies that alienate them from the ones they love. The virus that turns Blake from a loving father into a terrifying beast could be likened to a Joe Rogan podcast or an incel recruitment video. On a thematic level, this is a much deeper Wolfman than we've ever had before, but not everything here is worth howling at. The dialogue, especially at the start, is dreadfully direct. When Blake explains to Ginger how parents sometimes emotionally scar their children, he might as well look into the camera and say, "This is what the movie is about." I'm also exhausted by modern filmmakers sucking the life out of a film through color grading. Nosferatu is forgivable because that was a stylistic choice that fit the gothic horror narrative. But here, the blue skies and scenic vistas that bookend the film are dulled by a muted color palette that makes everything feel dreary and hopeless. We're also faced with the most common of horror tropes, such as the lack of cell phone service in the woods and the creepy neighbor we're not quite sure about. Luckily, the film does attempt to subvert expectations every now and then, but those subversions don't inject excitement into the few slow, dragging portions of the second act. I wasn't so much anticipating what was coming next, but wondering when something was going to happen. Finally, there are the performances. Christopher Abbott feels like a cross between Mark Ruffalo and Chris Messina. He's likable but also pathetic, and not in a bad way. We feel for him and everything he's going through, both before and after his transformation. Matilda Firth also holds her own here, skating the line between precocious scamp and insufferable annoyance quite well. But Julia Garner left me wanting more. She was cold and disconnected from her co-stars, coming across more like the new stepmom than Ginger's actual mother. That might have been by design as a way to make her own transformation into a mom now bonded to her daughter more palpable. But her aloofness for the first two-thirds of the movie was a distraction. What Leigh Whannell has done here isn't quite a remake, but a reimagining. He's ventured off a well-trodden path and forged one of his own. And although he's tripped over a few rocks here and there, what he's made is a solid, competent commentary on generational trauma, toxic masculinity, and the risks of constant isolation, all of which is accented by a haunting orchestral score by Benjamin Wallfisch. Universal's Wolfman, directed by Leigh Whannell and starring Christopher Abbott, Julia Garner, and Matilda Firth, gets 3.5 stars out of 5. It's in theaters now. My thanks to Cinema Lab and the Village at Sopak Theater in South Orange, New Jersey, for inviting me to an early screening last night. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in the lobby.